The word hit her like a bullet she had not seen coming. Leave. Lenora Beckett stood in the doorway of Isaac Carson's kitchen, her coat still buttoned to the throat, the December wind howling at her back through the gap she had not yet closed, and she stared at the man she had spent the last 4 months learning how to love. He was standing at the far end of the room with his back to her, both hands pressed flat against the wooden counter, and his shoulders were rigid in a way she had never seen before, rigid and shaking at the same time, like a wall that was deciding whether to hold or collapse. Isaac. His name came out of her mouth thin and breakable. He did not turn around. I said leave, Lenora. His voice was low and scraped clean of everything soft. Go back to town. Go back to wherever it is you came from before this. Just go. The lantern on the table between them threw amber light across the floor planks, and she could see her own shadow stretching toward him, long and trembling. 4 months. 4 months of suppers and silences and small miraculous moments, where something between them had been built so carefully, so deliberately, piece by piece like a winter fence. And now his hands were on that counter, and his voice was a closed door, and she could not understand what had shattered. You are going to have to look at me if you want me to believe you mean it, she said, and her voice steadied on its own, which surprised her. He turned around. That was when she saw it. Not anger, not coldness. It was something far more dangerous than either of those things. His dark eyes were full of a kind of reckless grief, the kind that comes when a person has made a decision they believe is for someone else's benefit and they are trying very hard not to take it back. There is a man coming, Isaac said, quietly and with terrible finality. A man from your past, and when he gets here, everything I've let myself believe about what we were building is going to burn down. So I am asking you to walk away from this before the fire starts, because I would rather lose you clean than watch you be destroyed by what I cannot protect you from. Lenora Beckett had survived too much to be frightened by the future. But in that moment, standing in Isaac Carson's kitchen in December with the wind screaming outside and his eyes saying goodbye, she understood that the real story had not begun in this kitchen tonight. It had begun 4 months ago, in the last gasp of August, on the worst day of her life. She had been running, not the way people run when they are late or afraid of small things. She had been running the way a person runs when every single road behind them has been burned. It had been August of 1878, and Lenora Beckett was 26 years old and owned nothing but the dress on her back, the carpetbag in her hand, and a letter of reference that was now worthless because the woman who had written it was 3 weeks dead. She had come west from Missouri 2 years prior at the urging of her older brother, Caleb, who had written her a letter full of optimism about land and opportunity and the particular freedom of starting new. She had arrived in Harlan County, Kansas, to find Caleb's land claim was in a legal dispute. Caleb himself was working a cattle drive and not expected back until fall, and the boarding house where she had taken a room had burned to the ground 6 days after her arrival due to a stovepipe fire. She had rebuilt herself carefully after that. She had found work as a seamstress in the town of Greer's Crossing, a small settlement that sat in the wide, flat center of the county like a forgotten button on a coat. She had earned enough to rent a room above the dry goods store from Mrs. Hargrove, who was severe and fair and never asked personal questions, which Lenora appreciated more than she could say. She had been building something modest and real and her own. Then Harmon Voss had arrived. Harmon Voss was 38 years old and had the kind of face that people described as handsome before they knew him well enough to understand that handsome was the least important thing about him. He was a speculator, though he called himself a land developer, and he had come to Greer's Crossing with money and connections, and a particular appetite for acquiring things that belonged to other people. He had first come to her with an offer of work, claiming he needed a skilled seamstress for the household of a client. She had accepted because she needed the income, and for 3 weeks the arrangement had been ordinary. Then he had told her that the land Caleb's claim sat on had been quietly transferred to Voss's company through a filing error he had personally engineered. He had told her this the way men like him tell things, calmly and with a slight smile, as though the cruelty of the information was simply a fact of nature. He had also made clear that the resolution of this error was negotiable, depending on Lenora's willingness to become more personally cooperative. She had told him exactly what he could do with his negotiation. He had told her she would regret it. 2 days later, Mrs. Hargrove had received an anonymous letter accusing Lenora of theft. The letter was a lie, but the accusation was enough. Mrs. Hargrove, despite being severe and fair, was also cautious, and she asked Lenora to vacate the room. The seamstress who had been referring work to Lenora suddenly found herself too busy to send more clients. The letter of reference from the schoolteacher, who had been Lenora's most reliable advocate in town, was nullified when the schoolteacher quietly left Greer's Crossing for reasons she would not discuss. Lenora had understood then that Harmon Voss was not simply petty. He was methodical. He had the patience and the resources to slowly close every door, and he would close them all, one at a time, until the only door left open was his. So she had run. She had taken what she had. She had walked out of Greer's Crossing in the early blue light of a Tuesday morning, and she had headed north along the creek road because it was the only direction she had not exhausted, and she had walked until her feet were bleeding and the sun was overhead, and she was somewhere in the open grassland north of town with no idea where she was going. That was when she had seen the smoke. Not disaster smoke. Ordinary smoke. Cookfire smoke, drifting in a thin column above a tree line to the east, and because she had no better options, she had turned toward it. The property was not large, but it was serious. A solid farmhouse made of lumber and local stone, a barn that was well maintained, a vegetable garden that had been planted with care, a well with a proper crank handle, and a man splitting wood in the yard who stopped when he saw her coming across the field and stood with his axe at his side and watched her approach without expression. He was 30 years old, she would learn later. Tall, with dark brown hair that had grown a little past what was probably his usual preference, and the kind of build that came from actual work rather than performance. His face was angular and private. He had dark eyes that were careful in a way she would come to recognize as native to him, not wariness exactly, but the habit of a person who had learned to observe the world before acting in it. She stopped at the edge of his yard. "I am sorry to come on your land without warning," she said, because she had always believed that courtesy cost nothing and bought considerable good. "My name is Lenora Beckett. I have been walking since early morning and I am in some difficulty. I'm not asking for charity, only for some water and perhaps the use of a road if you know of one that goes anywhere useful." He studied her for a moment. The axe remained at his side. He looked at her carpetbag, at her boots, at the state of her generally, and whatever assessment he made seemed to satisfy him because he lowered the axe and set it carefully against the woodpile. "Isaac Carson," he said. His voice was quiet but not unfriendly. "The well is there. Help yourself." She drank 2 full ladles of cold water while he watched from a respectful distance, and when she straightened up he was still there, not hovering, just present in the way that a person stands when they have decided something but have not yet said it. "You are headed somewhere specific?" he asked. "Not yet," she said honestly. He nodded slowly, as though this was information he had expected. "There is a stage road about 2 miles north. It runs east to Harlan and west to a junction. That is probably what you need." "Thank you," she said, and picked up her carpetbag. She had gone exactly 4 steps. "Stay for supper," he said. She stopped, turned around. He was looking at the ground beside her feet rather than directly at her, which she found oddly careful of him. "I have a rabbit stew on the stove," he said. "It is more than I need for one. You look like you could use a meal before you walk another 2 miles." It was practical. It was stated as practicality. But Lenora, who had spent her life reading the spaces between what people said and what they meant, looked at Isaac Carson standing in his yard with his private face and his careful eyes, and understood that this was not merely practical. He was offering her something. She was not entirely sure what, but it was something. She set the carpetbag down. "Thank you," she said again. "I would be grateful." They ate at his kitchen table as the light went amber, and then purple, and then dark, and he lit the lantern and put it on the table between them, and they talked with the careful deliberateness of two strangers who are each in their different ways profoundly alone, and have not yet admitted it to themselves. He asked about her situation in the way that a person asks when they genuinely want to understand rather than judge, and she told him the broad shape of it, leaving out the worst of Harmon Voss because she did not know yet whether she could trust this man with the worst of anything. He told her he had been on this land for 4 years. He had come out from Ohio after the death of his father, whose estate had left Isaac enough to buy land and nothing else. He had built the house himself over the first winter with the help of a neighbor named Elias Prout, who had since moved his family further west. He raised cattle, a modest herd, and kept the garden and the chickens and managed everything alone because that was how it had worked out. "You have no family nearby?" she asked. "No," he said simply. "My mother passed when I was 14. My father when I was 25. I have a sister in Cleveland, but we do not correspond often." She understood that he had said something painful without dressing it in self-pity, which she respected. He did not ask her to stay. When supper was done, he offered her the lantern to light her way to the stage road and a small bundle of cornbread wrapped in cloth for the journey, and she accepted both and thanked him and stood in the doorway for a moment with the night air coming in cold around her and the warm light of his kitchen at her back. "Mr. Carson," she said. "Isaac," he said quietly. "Isaac." The name settled into her mouth strangely, like something that fit better than she had expected. "You have been very kind. I hope your life goes well. And yours, Miss Beckett." She walked 2 miles in the dark to the stage road. The stage ran only on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it was Tuesday evening, and she had just missed it. She found a small way station building where the station master let her sleep on a bench for the night, and she lay there in the dark with the cornbread wrapped in cloth against her chest and thought about Isaac Carson's kitchen, and the way he had said stay for supper like it was ordinary when it was not ordinary at all. She took the stage east on Thursday to the town of Harlan, which was larger than Greer's Crossing, and where she did not know anyone, which felt, after recent events, like a significant advantage. She found work at a laundry. She found a room in a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Della who asked personal questions but was ultimately harmless. She began again, which she was becoming experienced at. But the weeks turned and she found herself thinking about Isaac Carson more than made logical sense. She told herself it was because of the meal, because of the unexpected kindness on a terrible day. These were sufficient explanations, she thought. They accounted for it. Then she received Caleb's letter. Her brother had returned from the cattle drive to find his claim in dispute, exactly as Voss had engineered it. The letter was worried and confused, and reading between Caleb's words, she could hear that he was frightened, though he would never admit to being frightened because he was Caleb and Caleb had always believed that fear was something that happened to other people. He said he was looking into it. He said not to worry. She worried. She also received, through means she had not anticipated, a second piece of information. Mrs. Della's husband, who worked at the county land office, mentioned one evening at dinner that there were several properties in the northern part of the county that were under the scrutiny of a land speculator named Voss. He mentioned one of those properties was a ranch north of Greer's Crossing run by a man named Carson. Lenora set her fork down. She did not return to Isaac Carson's property immediately, because she was not the kind of woman who acted on incomplete information. She spent 2 weeks writing careful letters to the county clerk's office and to a lawyer in Harlan named Mr. Aldous Graves, who had a reputation for being honest, which in 1878 in Harlan County was a distinguishing characteristic worth paying for. She gathered what she could. She confirmed what she feared. Harmon Voss had identified Isaac Carson's property as a target. The land was well situated near a creek, which made it valuable for watering cattle during dry summers, and Voss had filed a competing claim based on a surveying ambiguity in the original deed. The claim was likely fraudulent, but likely fraudulent was not the same as certainly overturnable, and without someone to help Isaac understand what was happening and navigate the legal complexity of it, he might lose everything before he understood the threat was real. On a Wednesday morning in late September, Lenora Beckett put on her better dress, packed her carpetbag, and hired a wagon ride north. Isaac was in the barn when she arrived. He came out at the sound of the wagon and stood in the barn door, and when he saw her, his expression did something complicated and quiet that he controlled almost immediately, so that by the time she climbed down from the wagon he simply looked measured and still, as though women who had eaten supper at his table once and then walked away into the dark regularly reappeared 2 months later in his yard. "Miss Beckett," he said, "I need to speak with you about something important," she said. "And then, if you are still willing to have me, I would very much like to ask whether you might need any help around this property until the situation resolves itself." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her carpetbag, then back at her face. "Come inside," he said. She told him about Voss. All of it this time, not just the broad shape but the specific details, including what Voss had done to her in Greer's Crossing, including what she had learned from the land office records, including the name of the lawyer she had already consulted. She laid it out on his kitchen table the way you lay out a map, methodically and without embellishment, because she respected him enough to give him the truth straight. He listened without interrupting. His face was still and attentive. She noticed that he had trimmed his hair since August and that there was a small scar on the back of his left hand that she had not noticed before. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How did you find out about my property specifically?" he asked. "The land office in Harlan. A man there mentioned it in conversation. And you came back to warn me." "Yes. You could have sent a letter." She looked at him. "A letter might not have been enough. And I know Harmon Voss personally in a way that might be useful. I know how he operates. I know what evidence he tends to fabricate and what records he tends to manipulate. And she paused. She had prepared this part, and it still felt vulnerable in ways she had not fully anticipated. "I also do not have a great many options at the present moment. The laundry in Harlan pays barely enough to survive, and I am a capable woman who can cook and sew and help manage a working property. If you need someone for the fall season, I can be useful to you. I would work for room and board until the spring. That is all I am asking." Isaac Carson was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "You have already been more useful to me this afternoon than anyone has in 4 years. He said it without sentiment, just matter of fact, which somehow made it more meaningful than if he had dressed it up. "I accept your offer. There is a room at the end of the hall. It was meant to be a second bedroom. It has never been used." He stood up, which seemed to mean the negotiation was concluded. "I was about to start supper," he added, moving toward the stove. "You might as well stay." She had to look down at the table to hide the way her face moved. She stayed. The first weeks were professional and careful. Lenora cooked and maintained the house and repaired the fencing on the south side of the garden, where a cattle stampede from a neighboring property 2 seasons ago had knocked 3 posts sideways. Isaac managed the cattle and cut the winter hay and made 2 trips into Harlan for supplies, the second of which he asked her to accompany him, because he needed her assistance identifying the correct type of thread for a harness repair, and she was more knowledgeable about such things. They were polite to each other. More than polite. They were attentive to each other in that careful way that happens when 2 people are being very deliberate about not being more than professional. She noticed things about him in the way that you notice things when you are trying not to. The way he always put the lantern in the exact same spot on the table before he sat down. The way he read in the evenings, which surprised her, because he had a shelf of books she had not expected, including a worn copy of David Copperfield and 2 volumes on agricultural practices, and a leather-bound Bible that looked like it had been read many times, and a collection of Shakespeare's tragedies that seemed incongruous and intriguing. The way he laughed, which was rare and therefore remarkable, a low and genuine sound that he seemed almost surprised by each time it happened. She found, without particularly intending to, that she was engineering small moments where it might occur. Meanwhile, the legal situation with Voss moved slowly. Mr. Aldous Graves wrote letters and filed counters and requested records and corresponded with the county clerk, and the process had the grinding, infuriating pace of all legal processes that are fighting against someone with money and patience. Isaac received a formal notice from the land office in mid-October informing him that his deed was under review. He read it at the table that evening and set it down with the deliberateness of a person setting down a heavy thing. "It will take time," Lenora said. "Graves says the original surveyor's notes are clear. Voss's claim relies on a measurement that cannot be supported. You trust this lawyer. I trust his reputation, and I trust the arithmetic. The numbers are on your side." He looked at her. It was a longer look than usual, or perhaps she had simply begun noticing the duration. "You are not frightened?" he asked. "I am frightened," she said honestly. "But I have found that being frightened of a problem and solving it are not mutually exclusive." Something in his face shifted, very subtly, but she had become expert at reading him in small print. "No," he said quietly, "I suppose they are not." October deepened into a cold, clear kind of beauty that the Kansas grasslands do in the weeks before the first hard frost, when the sky is an aggressive blue, and the grass has gone gold, and the mornings smell like ice. Lenora found herself standing at the kitchen window more than was strictly necessary, watching the light change over the flat horizon, and she understood that what she was feeling about this place had become entangled in a way that would have alarmed her if she had examined it directly. She did not examine it directly. She examined instead the progress of the legal filings and the state of the root cellar, and whether the window frames in the spare room needed recaulking against the coming winter drafts, which they did, and she dealt with that on a Tuesday while Isaac was in the south field, standing on a chair and working the caulking into the gaps with methodical focus. She was still on the chair when he came back. He stopped in the doorway of the spare room and looked at her and at the work she had done, and then he said quietly, "You did not have to do that." "The wind will find every gap it can," she said, climbing down from the chair. "Better to close them now." He was still in the doorway. The late afternoon light came in over his shoulder and made the room look warmer than it was. He had his hat in his hand, which meant he had taken it off before he came down the hall, and she could not have said why that detail mattered to her, only that it did. "Lenora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss in front of it. It was not the last time he would do it, but it was the first, and she felt it in the specific way that you feel the first version of something, acutely and permanently. "Yes," she said. He seemed to consider whatever he had intended to say, and then he took a different path. "I am going to town Friday for the winter supplies. I would appreciate your list when you have it written." "Of course," she said. He nodded and left the doorway. She stood alone in the recaulked room for a moment, her heart doing something she decided firmly to ignore. October became November, and November arrived in Harlan County the way it always does, abruptly and without ceremony, with a north wind that had been waiting behind the horizon since August and finally arrived with the flat gray weight of coming winter behind it. The first snow came on the 5th, not heavy, just a reminder, a thin white announcement that everything was about to change. They began spending the evenings closer to the stove. This was practical. The kitchen was the warmest room. She would mend or sew while he read, or she would read, because she had asked to borrow the Shakespeare and he had handed it to her with a look she could not decode. And they would sit on opposite sides of the stove with the lantern between them and the wind outside making the windows flex and bow in their frames. And it was the most domestic and peaceful and secretly dangerous situation Lenora had ever been in. They talked more in November. Long conversations about things that surprised her, about what they each believed about God, and whether doubt was compatible with faith, about the particular injustices of the land claim system, and what it meant for the wave of homesteaders moving west, about the books they had read and what they had taken from them. He had opinions that were carefully considered and sometimes changed when confronted with new information, which she found deeply attractive without meaning to. She told him more about Missouri, about her parents, who had died within a year of each other when she was 19, fever and then grief in that order, and how she and Caleb had managed the estate and found it insufficient and eventually dispersed it and gone separate ways. She told him about the seamstress in St. Louis who had taught her the trade in exchange for 3 years of work, and about the woman who had written the letter of reference and then died, and about what it felt like to be a woman alone in 1878 and trying to build something that was genuinely and entirely hers. He listened the way he did everything else, with his full attention, which was a quality in him she had begun to understand was rare and was something she was going to miss when she left, because she was going to leave. She reminded herself of this regularly, with the diligence of someone who needs reminding. The legal situation would resolve. Voss would be defeated or he would not, but either way the situation would reach its conclusion. And Caleb would come and she would go to Caleb. And Isaac Carson would remain on his property alone and build toward whatever future he was building toward. And this careful constructed winter life they were sharing would end. She reminded herself of this on the specific evening in mid-November when he came in from checking on the cattle in a sudden ice storm, his coat rigid with frozen sleet and his face reddened by the cold. And she took his coat from him and hung it by the stove to dry and then put a cup of hot coffee in his hands. And when he looked at her over the rim of the cup with his dark eyes, full of a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, she reminded herself firmly of every word she had just thought. It did not help as much as she needed it to. "I have been thinking," he said, after a silence in which she had returned to her chair and her sewing, and he had drunk most of the coffee. "About the property?" she asked. "No." He set the cup down. He looked at the stove. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and now cannot find the beginning of it. "About the fact that you came back," he said finally. "In September. You found out what Voss was doing and you came back to tell me, and you were under no obligation to do that. You did not know me. You had one supper at my table. You were kind to me when you had no reason to be," she said carefully. "I gave you water and some rabbit stew," he said. "Most people would have done that." "Most people did not." He was quiet. The stove clicked and settled. "Why did you really come back, Lenora?" She looked at her sewing for a moment. Then she looked at him. "Because you were in danger and I had information that could help, and I am not the kind of person who can possess information like that and walk away from it." "Is that the only reason?" The question sat in the room between them, warm and specific and requiring an honest answer. She thought about lying, and then she thought about the kind of person she wanted to be, and she said, "No. But the other reasons are ones I am not prepared to discuss." He nodded. He looked at the stove again. "That is fair," he said. "I have reasons I am not prepared to discuss either." The night outside pressed against the windows, and the stove snapped, and they sat in the warm light and did not discuss things, and it was somehow the most intimate conversation Lenora Beckett had ever had. 2 days later, a letter came from Harmon Voss. It was addressed to Isaac, but it had been intercepted at the Harlan post office by Aldous Graves, who had standing instructions to flag any correspondence from Voss's company. Graves forwarded it with his own letter of explanation. The letter from Voss to Isaac was a negotiation offer, dressed up in legal language, but the meaning was clear. Voss was offering to settle the claim dispute for a cash payment that represented roughly half the value of the property. He framed this as a fair resolution. The letter was polite and specifically threatening in the way that only polite letters can be. Isaac read it at the table. Lenora read the letter from Graves. They traded papers across the table. "He is scared," Lenora said. Isaac looked up from the Voss letter. "How do you know?" because he is offering to settle. He does not settle things unless he believes the fight is going to cost him more than the prize is worth. Graves must have found something significant in the surveying records. Isaac was quiet. Then, do you know this man well? Voss, she thought carefully about how to answer. I know how he thinks. He is careful with money and careless with people. He would not make an offer like this if he was confident of winning. Could he hurt you? Isaac asked. If he knows you are here, could he hurt you? The directness of the question reached her somewhere she had been keeping carefully guarded. He was not asking about the property or the legal situation. He was asking about her specifically, her safety, her person. He has already done what damage he can do to my reputation in Greer's Crossing, she said. He does not have the same leverage here. That is not quite an answer to what I asked. She met his eyes. He is not a man who uses direct physical violence. He uses systems and money and the machinery of legal filing. He could make things complicated. He could not hurt me the way you mean. Isaac looked at her for a long moment. Then he folded the Voss letter with precise movements and set it aside. I am going to write to Graves and tell him to reject the settlement, he said. If we have the evidence to beat this legitimately, I want to beat it legitimately. I think that is the right decision, Lenora said. And I want you to know, he added, his voice quieter, that whatever happens with the legal situation, your arrangement here is not contingent on it. You do not need to be useful to have a place here. The sentence landed in her chest with a weight she had not anticipated. Isaac, she said. I mean it practically, he said quickly, in the tone of a man who is not sure he means it only practically. It is a hard winter and you are sensible and the situation with Voss has not resolved and it does not make sense for you to be elsewhere. That is very practical, she said. Yes, he said. He picked up the Voss letter again unnecessarily and looked at it. Isaac, he looked up. Thank you, she said. He nodded and looked at the letter again, but she could see that something in his face had quietly arranged itself into something resembling peace. And she understood that they had said several things to each other just now that were not in the words they had used, and that they had both understood all of them. November became late November, and late November in Harlan County meant the full commitment of winter, not the flirtatious cold of October or the preliminary cold of early November, but the real and serious cold that settled into the ground and the walls and the spaces between words. The cattle were managed in shorter rotations. The cellar was checked. The firewood was measured and calculated against the projected weeks of cold. They developed routines that were intimate without being romantic, except that everything was romantic if she was honest about it, which she was trying not to be. He had begun taking her opinion on practical matters as a natural course of action. She had begun keeping his coffee warm without being asked, because she had learned the rhythms of when he came in from the field. They argued twice, both times productively, once about the best way to store the grain against the mice that were finding their way in through the barn wall, and once about whether the letter Caleb had sent deserved a more urgent response than Lenora was giving it. Isaac had been right about Caleb. She had written a longer and more honest letter to her brother after their argument about it, and the relief she felt after doing so was something she credited privately to Isaac. Caleb wrote back quickly. He had found a lawyer in Greer's Crossing who was looking into the claim dispute on his end. He had also heard, through the small and reliable gossip network of Harlan County, that Lenora was living on a ranch north of the county somewhere and working for a man named Carson, and his letter asked several questions about this arrangement that were phrased casually and therefore unmistakably, as the questions of an older brother trying to understand the situation. She wrote back that the arrangement was professional and appropriate. She did not write back that she had begun dreaming about Isaac Carson's voice saying her name, or that she had spent an embarrassing amount of time one afternoon noticing the particular way he moved through the rooms of his own house with a kind of unhurried certainty that she found more compelling than she knew how to account for. She told herself these were the natural effects of isolation, of a long winter in a small house with one other person. She told herself she was confusing proximity for connection, comfort for attachment. She told herself this on the evening in late November when he came in from the barn and found her at the table crying over a letter. It was not Caleb's letter. It was a letter from Mrs. Hargrove, the boarding house keeper in Greer's Crossing, who had tracked down her address through Caleb's wife. Mrs. Hargrove, who was severe and fair, had written to apologize. She had learned that the letter accusing Lenora of theft had been fabricated, and she had learned this from another of Voss's victims who had come forward. She was sorry, she wrote, for the distress she had caused. She hoped Miss Beckett was well. It was a sincere letter. It was also the first acknowledgment Lenora had received from anyone in Greer's Crossing that they understood what had been done to her, and the relief of it had arrived without warning and produced tears she had not prepared for. Isaac did not make the mistake of pretending she was not crying. He set down what he was carrying and came to the table and sat down and waited. She told him about the letter. Her voice was steadier than she expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it is worth, I think anyone who had known you for 5 minutes would have understood that accusation was a lie." She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "You did not know me for 5 minutes," she said. "I knew you for one supper," he said, "and I knew it." She pressed her hand briefly over her mouth and then put it back in her lap because she was not going to cry more. "I appreciate that," she said finally. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his for just a moment, warm and deliberate, and then gone. And then he stood up and went to the stove to check on the coffee as though the gesture had been nothing at all. And Lenora Beckett understood, with the crystalline clarity of a heart that has finally stopped arguing with itself, that she had fallen completely in love with Isaac Carson, and that there was nothing she was going to be able to do about it. December came. With it came the letter from Aldous Graves that confirmed what they had hoped for. The original surveyor's field notes had been located in the state archives, and they were explicit and unambiguous. The measurement Voss's claim relied upon was demonstrably incorrect by a margin that could not be attributed to error. Graves had filed the counterclaim and expected a formal ruling within 3 to 4 weeks. His letter was cautiously optimistic in the way that honest lawyers are cautious, noting that nothing was final until the ruling was issued, but that the evidence was as strong as any he had seen. Lenora brought the letter to Isaac in the barn because she did not want to wait. He read it once and then read it again. Then he set it down on the top rail of the nearest stall with the deliberateness of someone who is managing a feeling rather than suppressing it. "It is not over yet," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is close." "When it is over," she said, and then stopped. He looked at her. She was aware that she had begun a sentence she did not know how to finish and that this was transparent. "When it is over," he repeated quietly, inviting her to continue. She made a decision. "When it is over, I will need to think about what comes next, for me, where I go." There was a silence in the barn that was full of things neither of them had yet said aloud. "Yes," he said finally carefully, "I suppose you will." He picked the letter up again. "I am grateful, Lenora, for all of it, for coming back, for everything you have done here." He paused. "I want you to know that." "I know," she said. She walked back to the house. She told herself that he had not said stay. She told herself she could not ask for it because what they were, whatever this was, lived in the spaces between things and had never been named. And naming it required courage she was not sure she had, and furthermore she did not know if the feeling was mutual in the specific and permanent way she needed it to be. She told herself all of this, very firmly, in the kitchen, standing at the window with her arms folded, watching the snow that had started to come down again over the flat white fields. Then she heard his boots on the porch. He came in and closed the door and stood in the kitchen and said, "I need to tell you something." She turned from the window. "A man is coming," he said. His voice was low and scraped clean of everything soft. "A man from your past." She felt the cold move through her without any help from the winter. "Voss," she said. "He sent a rider with a message. It came while you were in the barn with me." He held up a folded paper. "He knows you are here." He has been watching this situation, and he knows you have been helping me fight his claim. He is coming to Harlan County himself to deal with the situation in person. He put the paper on the table. And I have been standing out there in the barn for the past 10 minutes deciding what to tell you, and I have decided that I am going to tell you the truth, which is that I do not know if I can keep you safe from this, Lenora. I do not know if my property is more dangerous for you than somewhere else would be, and if that is the case, then my having allowed you to stay here to become involved in this has been selfish on my part. She crossed the room and picked up the paper and read it. It was not from Voss directly. It was from a man identifying himself as Voss's associate, informing Isaac that Mr. Voss intended to visit the county in person to address the matter of the fraudulent counterclaim, and that certain parties who had provided false testimony should consider their legal exposure carefully. "He is threatening me," she said. "Yes, with a legal proceeding that would have no merit." "Probably no merit," Isaac said. "But Lenora, probably and certainly are not the same thing, and if he comes here with money and a lawyer and the intention to make your life very difficult, I am not equipped to prevent that in every possible way." "So you want me to leave," she said. He looked at her. In his eyes was everything she had identified earlier in the evening by the window of the barn, that reckless grief, that costly decision. "I want you to be safe," he said. "Those are not the same thing. But if staying here puts you at risk of something I cannot stop, then I would rather you leave and be safe than stay and be hurt." "Even if he stopped." "Even if what?" she said. He was quiet for a long moment. The lantern threw amber light across his face. "Even if losing you would be the hardest thing that has happened to me in a very long time," he said. He said it the way he said everything honest and important, plainly and without ornamentation, and it landed in her chest like a hand pressed flat against her heart. She thought about the past 4 months. She thought about rabbit stew and cornbread in the dark, and legal letters and arguments about grain storage and Shakespeare's tragedies, and the moment he had covered her hand with his on the night of Mrs. Hargrove's letter. She thought about how she had walked away into the dark in August believing she would not see this place again, and how she had come back in September because she could not help herself, and how she had told herself all the way through November that what she felt was proximity and isolation, and not something real and large and permanent. She thought about the specific and reckless feeling she had right now in this kitchen, with his words still in the air between them. "Harmon Voss," she said with great precision, "has already taken my room, my livelihood, my reputation in one town, and several weeks of peace of mind. He has engineered false accusations and manipulated legal systems, and spent considerable effort trying to make me into someone with no standing and nowhere to go." She put the paper down on the table. "He is not going to take this." Isaac looked at her. "Lenora, I am not leaving," she said. "I am not leaving because I am not going to allow a man like Harmon Voss to define the boundaries of my life for one more day. And I am also not leaving," she continued, and her voice had gone quiet and clear in the way of a person who has stopped being careful, "because I do not want to leave. Because this is the first place in a long time that has felt like something real, and you are the reason for that, and I think you know it." The kitchen was very quiet. Isaac Carson looked at her across the amber light of the lantern for a long and complete moment, and then he came around the table. He cupped her face in both his hands, the way you hold something you are afraid of breaking and also afraid of never touching again, and he looked at her for one more second, and she had just enough time to notice that his hands were shaking slightly before he pressed his forehead gently against hers and said, very quietly, in a voice that had shed every layer of careful control, "Stay." "Yes," she said. He kissed her the way she had been waiting for him to kiss her since sometime in October without admitting it, with the full and unhurried intention of a man who has finally stopped arguing with himself. And she held onto him in the kitchen, with the lantern burning between them and the December wind outside making promises against the windows. When he finally pulled back, he was still holding her face, and she was still holding the front of his coat, and they were both slightly undone in a way that was entirely appropriate. "You said stay differently that time," she said. Something broke open in his face that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for, that low, surprised laugh. It filled the kitchen like warmth. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I did." They sat together at the table after that for a long time, not needing to do anything in particular, just being in the same space with the new weight of honesty between them, which was not heavy at all but felt instead like a door that had finally opened after a long time of both of them standing on the same side of it. "What do we do about Voss?" she said, eventually. "We write to Graves in the morning," Isaac said. His hand was covering hers on the table, openly this time, not a brief gesture but a declaration. "We tell him Voss is coming in person and we want to be prepared, and then we wait for the ruling, which Graves believes will come before Christmas. And if Voss arrives before the ruling, then I meet him at my property line and explain to him that he is trespassing, and that I have a lawyer and the county surveyor's records on my side, and that if he has a dispute with you personally, he can take it up with the law." He paused. "And I will also make clear that anything he intends toward you is something he will have to go through me to accomplish." She looked at him. "Isaac, I am entirely capable of handling Harmon Voss myself." "I know you are," he said, without hesitation. "I am simply offering to stand beside you while you do." She turned her hand over under his and closed her fingers around his, and that was the agreement. Voss arrived on the 20th of December. He came in a hired rig from Harlan with a man who appeared to be a lawyer and another man who appeared to be neither a lawyer nor a ranch hand, but something in between. The kind of man you hired when you wanted legal muscle without using actual violence. He came to the property in the early afternoon when the sky was that flat, bright white of an overcast winter day. Isaac was in the yard when the rig came up the road. Lenora was beside him. Voss climbed down from the rig and looked at them both. He was exactly as she remembered him, that careful, handsome face with the practiced pleasantness over something colder underneath. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, with an expression that contained surprise and calculation in equal measure. "Miss Beckett," he said, "I had heard you were here, but I confess I did not quite believe it." "Mr. Voss," she said. He looked at Isaac. "Carson, I think we have some things to discuss." "We do not," Isaac said, with a quiet directness that was not aggressive but that left no room for negotiation. "We have a legal process that is nearly concluded, and unless you have come to withdraw your fraudulent claim in person, you are welcome to communicate with my lawyer, whose address you already have." Voss's pleasant expression did not waver. "I thought we might be able to resolve this more informally, save everyone the expense." "Your last informal resolution offer was a settlement worth half the property's value," Isaac said. "I declined it then. I decline it now." Voss looked at Lenora. "And you? I think you understand what position you are in here. Your testimony regarding the surveying records was factual," Lenora said. "The records exist. The measurements are what they are. There is no testimony to challenge because the arithmetic does not change based on your preferences." "There are other matters," Voss said, and his voice had shifted into the specific register she recognized, the one that meant he was moving to a different kind of pressure. "Matters related to your credibility, your history. A woman alone, living on a man's property without the benefit of, she is going to be my wife," Isaac said. Lenora looked at him. He was looking at Voss and his jaw was set, and his voice had not changed in volume, but it had changed in everything else. Then he looked at her for 1 second, and in that 1 second he communicated several things, the most important of which was that he meant it, and the second most important of which was that he was sorry for the manner of delivery, and the third most important of which was that they would discuss it properly later. She looked back at Voss. Voss's pleasant expression had finally encountered something it could not manage. He looked between them. "The ruling from the county will come before the end of the month," Lenora said, into the silence. "It will be in Isaac's favor because the evidence is unambiguous." When it comes, your claim will be dismissed, and if you attempt to file another variation of it, Mr. Graves will be pursuing the fraudulent filing itself as a legal matter. You have already lost this. I suggest you leave now and save yourself the cost of whatever your lawyer is charging you by the day." Voss looked at her for a long moment. The calculation was visible, the particular calculation of a man who is deciding whether to push further or cut losses, and she watched it run its course, and she did not look away, and beside her Isaac was absolutely still and absolutely present. Voss got back into the rig. He did not say anything further. He did not need to. His leaving was the statement. They watched the rig go back down the road until it disappeared around the tree line. Then Isaac turned to look at her. "I apologize for the manner in which I said that," he said. "It was not the way I intended to ask you." She looked at him. "Were you going to ask me?" A beat. "Yes, I had been thinking about how to do it properly for the past week." He looked briefly pained. "I had intended candlelight and considerably more preparation." "You still can," she said. He looked at her. The winter light was pale and flat above them, and his breath was visible in the cold air, and he looked nothing like a man in a romance novel. He looked like a real man on a cold December afternoon who had just defended her in the plainest and most sincere way possible, and she loved him for it with a completeness that astonished her. He took her hand. "Lenora Beckett," he said, "I have been alone on this land for 4 years, and I had made a private peace with that, or believed I had. And then you walked across that field in August with your carpetbag and your damaged boots and your absolute refusal to be diminished by anything that had been done to you, and I have not been able to stop thinking about what this place might be if you were in it. Not just through the winter, not just until the situation with Voss resolved. Always." He paused. His thumb moved across her knuckles in a small and deliberate motion. "I love you. I would very much like to marry you if you will have me. And I want you to know that this is not connected to Voss, or to the property, or to anything practical. It is connected only to the fact that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I do not want to spend one more season without you." She was aware that her eyes were doing something she generally preferred they not do in the middle of cold afternoon. She was aware that the past 4 months had been moving inexorably toward this moment, and that the moment had arrived, and that she had never in her life been more certain of anything. "Yes," she said, and it was the same word she had said in the kitchen, but it sounded different now, larger and more permanent. "Yes, Isaac, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms there in the yard, in the cold December air, and held her the way you hold something you have been waiting for long enough that the weight has become part of you, and she put her face against his neck and felt him breathe out slowly, the long exhale of a man who has finally let himself believe the thing he was afraid to believe. "Candlelight still," he said, into her hair. "Tonight." She laughed, and it was not a small laugh. It was a full laugh that went up into the winter air and dissolved there. They went inside. The ruling from the county land office came on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, and it was exactly what Aldous Graves had predicted. Voss's claim was dismissed. The surveying records were upheld. Isaac's deed was affirmed in its entirety. The letter from Graves included a note that the dismissal had been filed with a notation regarding the fraudulent nature of the original competing claim, and that any future attempts by Voss or his associated companies to file on the same grounds would be subject to immediate legal scrutiny. Isaac read the letter and set it on the table and looked at Lenora for a long moment. "It is over," he said. "It is over," she agreed. He crossed the room and kissed her with a thoroughness that made the whole situation very clear, and then pulled back and said, "I believe I promised you candlelight." "You have work to do first," she said, gesturing at the window. "The cattle," he pointed at the ruling letter, "the cattle will be more patient than I am." "The cattle," she said firmly, "do not care about Harmon Voss's defeat, which means they still need their evening feed regardless of the day's victories." He laughed and got his coat. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go to the barn, and she thought about August and the smoke signal of his cook fire that had drawn her across the field, and September when she had come back with a carpet bag and a collection of legal records, and the second chance she had been afraid to name, and October with its careful conversations and its shy November silences and its December clarity. She thought about the word stay and all its different meanings, and how the same word can be a hospitality and a hope and a question and a plea and a declaration depending on the voice and the season and what has happened between the first time it is spoken and the last. She turned away from the window and began making supper. Christmas Eve they had Aldous Graves and his wife over for dinner, because Graves had earned it, and it was a warm and happy evening with the fire going, and the table full, and Graves making cheerful legal jokes that were mostly incomprehensible but well-intentioned. After the guests left and the kitchen was cleared, Isaac produced a ring that had been his mother's, a small band of gold with a single blue stone set in it, and put it on Lenora's hand with a ceremony that was entirely private and entirely sufficient. She looked at it on her hand. It fit perfectly, which she chose to take as a sign. "Your mother's," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. She was also someone who did not allow difficult circumstances to make her smaller. She looked up from the ring. He was looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that still surprised her when it appeared, that expression she had watched him build toward over 4 months of careful revelation. "I am going to spend a long time liking you," she told him. "Only liking," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing she loved. "Loving," she said. "I am going to spend a long time loving you. The liking is just a bonus." He kissed her again, and this time the candles he had set up on the table were burning between them, because he had kept his promise, and the light was warm and steady and very much like the man himself. They were married on a Saturday in February of 1879 in the small Methodist church in Harlan, which was the nearest one, presided over by a minister named Reverend Alderman who had a kind face and a long sermon that Lenora paid only partial attention to because she was looking at Isaac standing beside her in his best coat, which she had pressed that morning, looking at her with the steady and particular attention she had come to understand meant everything. Caleb came. He had arrived 2 days before the wedding, taking the stage from Greer's Crossing where his own legal situation had also been resolved, the lawyer he had found having been equally successful in defeating Voss's fraudulent claim on his land. Caleb was 32, broad-shouldered, with Lenora's same brown eyes, and he stood in Isaac's kitchen the evening he arrived and spent the first 10 minutes conducting what was clearly a brotherly assessment of Isaac under the guise of conversation. Isaac underwent this with patience and steady good humor. Caleb afterward told Lenora privately that he approved, and that Isaac was exactly the kind of man he had hoped she would find, solid and honest and clearly in a state of considerable happiness, that he was doing his absolute best not to display openly, which Caleb said was a good quality. "He is showing you the best version of himself," Lenora said. "No," Caleb said, with the certainty of a man who has assessed many people. "He is just himself. That is better." The wedding was small and real, and the February light through the church windows was the pale, clean light of a winter that was thinking about ending. Lenora wore her best dress, which she had remade and retrimmed in the weeks before, and Isaac held her hand at the altar with both of his and said the words with the directness and sincerity of a man who means every syllable, and she said hers back in the same spirit. When Reverend Alderman concluded and Isaac kissed her, Caleb made an undignified noise of celebration in the pew behind them, and Aldous Graves and his wife applauded, and even Reverend Alderman smiled, and Lenora laughed into Isaac's mouth, and it was not dignified and it was perfect. Spring arrived on the Carson property with the eagerness that spring always has after a hard winter, as though the world has been waiting and can no longer contain itself. The grass came back in waves from the south, and the creek ran high with snowmelt, and the cattle were moved to the south pasture where the new growth was thickest, and the garden was turned and planted. Isaac and Lenora worked it together, which was different from how it had been in the fall when she had managed the garden largely alone. There was something different about working the same ground side by side when you both belonged to it. She wrote to Caleb regularly. He had gone back to his property in Greer's Crossing with his legal situation resolved and his claim secure, and his letters were cheerful and news-filled, and he had mentioned, 3 times now in passing, the name of a woman named Harriet who ran the general store, which Lenora noted with deep and sisterly satisfaction. She wrote to Mrs. Hargrove in Greer's Crossing and received a warm letter back. She wrote to Aldous Graves thanking him for his work, and received a letter from Graves's wife thanking her for the Christmas dinner. She did not write to Harmon Voss, because Harmon Voss had moved on to other counties and other fraudulent claims, which was a problem for those counties and not hers, and she had done what she could, and would trust that his particular approach to the world would eventually produce its own consequences. She thought about this once, standing in the garden in April with the smell of turned earth around her, and she thought about how the situation that had driven her out of Greer's Crossing with bleeding feet, and a carpetbag had brought her across a field toward a plume of cookfire smoke, and that the worst thing that had happened to her had deposited her at the door of the best thing that had ever happened to her, and she found that a remarkable thing about the nature of circumstance. She was thinking this when Isaac came around the corner of the house and found her standing in the garden looking at the sky. "You are philosophizing again," he said. He had learned to recognize this expression. "I am," she agreed. He came to stand beside her. He was holding a letter. "This came from the post," he said. "From Caleb." She took it and read it. Caleb's news was abundant and included several more mentions of Harriet. "My brother," she said, handing the letter back, "is in a significant amount of trouble and has no idea." Isaac read the letter. "The woman who runs the general store. He mentions her 7 times in 12 paragraphs. Isaac looked at the letter. "He only actually names her 4 times. The other 3 are someone I know, and a person here who has been helpful, and a woman in town, in a sentence that has nothing to do with women in town." Isaac read again and then made a sound that was the precursor to his laugh. "You are right, he is in considerable trouble. I should write to her directly," Lenora said. "Harriet, just to introduce myself." "You should absolutely not do that," Isaac said, but he was laughing now. "It would move things along. It would terrify your brother. Caleb needs terrifying sometimes. It is good for him." She did not write to Harriet directly. She wrote to Caleb and asked, very casually, whether he might bring Harriet along when he came to visit in the summer, because it was always nice to meet neighbors when you had the chance. This produced a letter from Caleb that was very long and very not about Harriet, which told her everything. Summer came full and warm, and the Carson property was in good order, and Lenora had by July achieved the particular contentment that she had always privately feared was not something available to her, the kind that is not dramatic or urgent but is simply present, like the solid walls of a house that fits you. She was also, by July, reasonably certain of something else. She told Isaac on a Sunday evening, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table where they had eaten their first supper together 11 months ago. She told him plainly and directly in the way she told him everything because that was the language they had built together. He was very still for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his face did something she had never seen it do before. It opened completely, all the way down, no layers and no careful management, just pure and overwhelming feeling. "Lenora," he said, and her name in his voice in that moment was something she would carry for the rest of her life. He came around the table and held her, and she could feel that he was not quite breathing normally. "Are you all right?" she said into his shoulder. "I am so far from all right," he said, in a voice that was rough with something wonderful. I don't have a word for what I am." "Happy," she suggested. "More than that," he said. She held him back and thought that she too did not have a word for what she was, only that it was very large and very warm and had been growing since August of last year when she had crossed a field toward a plume of smoke on the worst day of her life. Caleb did come to visit in August, and he brought Harriet, and Harriet was exactly the kind of person Lenora had hoped she would be, forthright and funny, and clearly besotted with Caleb. In a way, she was managing only slightly more gracefully than he was managing his equivalent feeling. The four of them spent 3 days together on the Carson property, and the evenings on the porch and the conversations were easy and warm. And on the last night, Caleb took Isaac aside and said something that Isaac later reported to Lenora with the expression of a man who has been both formally accepted and mildly interrogated. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said he was glad I had made you happy," Isaac said. "And then he asked me 6 questions about my cattle management that I am fairly certain were actually about my character." "Did you pass?" "He shook my hand afterward, so I believe so." She kissed him for that. Caleb and Harriet were engaged by September. Lenora received Caleb's letter about it and read it to Isaac at the breakfast table, and they were both unreasonably delighted. "I may have written one small letter to Harriet," Lenora admitted. Isaac looked at her over his coffee. "Just to introduce myself," she said. He shook his head, but he was smiling. The baby came in January of 1880, on a cold and clear morning when the frost was thick on the windows, and the sun came up orange over the flat white world. He arrived with the particular determination of a person who has somewhere to be, and he was healthy and loud, and had Isaac's dark hair, and what appeared to be Lenora's opinion about things, expressed loudly and immediately. They named him James, after Isaac's father, and Caleb came and held him with the careful reverence of a man who does not quite trust himself not to break small things. And Harriet, who was herself expecting by then, watched Caleb hold the baby with an expression of such pure affection that Lenora had to look away before she embarrassed herself. James Carson was not a quiet baby, but he was a good one, which is a different quality entirely. He had strong opinions and expressed them without hesitation, which Lenora found charming and Isaac found philosophically interesting, and which everyone who visited found exhausting in the way that is actually secretly admirable. Isaac with the baby was something Lenora had not anticipated, though in retrospect she should have, because he brought to fatherhood the same qualities he brought to everything: full attention and patient consistency, and a kind of gentle certainty that communicated itself to the baby with immediate effect. James settled more quickly in Isaac's arms than in anyone else's, which Lenora told him about with a frankness that made him look briefly undone. "He knows you," she said. "He is 3 weeks old," Isaac said. "He knows you," she repeated. Spring came again, their second spring on the property together, and it was different from the first because now James was in it, in the garden in a little basket while they worked, watching the sky with the interested confusion of someone for whom sky is a recent discovery. The cattle were expanded by 6 head, purchased from a neighbor who was reducing his herd, which put the Carson operation into a comfortable and sustainable range. The legal situation with Voss was fully concluded, and there had been no further communication from him or his associates. The property was theirs in the full sense, secured and thriving. Lenora stood at the kitchen window one evening in April while Isaac sat at the table reading to James from David Copperfield, which James was clearly not following but was clearly content to listen to, watching his father's face with the single-minded attention of someone for whom that face is the most important thing in the room. And it was, she thought. It was important to her too. She thought about August of 1878, about being 26 and running, about the smoke in the sky that had drawn her to a yard, and a man with an axe and no particular reason to invite her in except that he had 1 supper's worth of rabbit stew, and was the kind of person who does not think twice about sharing it. "Stay for supper," he had said the first night, like it was the simplest thing in the world, and by winter he was saying it differently, and by the following August she was his wife. And by January she was the mother of his son, and the keeper of his home, and the person who knew every book on his shelf and every expression in his vocabulary of small and private feelings, and the person for whom he still daily, without ceremony, said it, in the way he had been saying it since December, not as an invitation but as a fact, not stay for supper but stay, simply and completely, in the way that meant for everything, for always. For the whole long life of this place, they had built together. She turned from the window. He looked up from the book. James looked up too, following his father's attention. "Supper is almost ready," she said. "Sit down," Isaac said. "I will finish it." She sat down across from him, James between them in his little chair, and the lantern was in its exact same spot on the table as it always was, because Isaac always put it there, and the stove was warm, and the winter was past, and the spring was real, and the property was theirs, and all the doors that had been closed against her. By circumstance and by cruelty, and by the long grinding difficulty of being a woman alone in 1878, with nothing but her own considerable capability to rely on, were open now. All of them open. She looked at her husband and her son in the amber lantern light and felt the particular fullness of a life that has arrived, not at perfection, because perfection is a false and static thing, but at rightness, the deep structural rightness of a story that has found its shape. "What are you thinking?" Isaac said, watching her. She smiled. "That I am glad I came across your field." He looked at her with that open, unguarded face that still surprised her, that face that had taken 4 months to build to and had not closed since December. "So am I," he said, "every single day." Caleb and Harriet named their daughter Clara, born in October of 1880, and she had Harriet's red hair and Caleb's laugh, which was a favorable combination. Caleb wrote letters about her with the uncontained enthusiasm of a man who had not known before that this kind of love was available, and Lenora read every one of them to Isaac in the evenings with profound sisterly satisfaction. James took his first steps in November, deliberate and slightly furious about the difficulty of it, which was such a true expression of his general character that both his parents laughed and then felt guilty about laughing, and then laughed again. He walked across the kitchen floor with his arms out for balance, and arrived at Isaac's legs and grabbed on with both hands, and looked up with an expression of triumph that was completely justified. Isaac picked him up and held him at shoulder height, and James looked at the world from up there with the considering expression of someone who is deciding whether it meets his standards. And Lenora stood across the kitchen and watched her husband and her son in the November light and understood clearly and completely that everything had been worth it. Not just the good things, all of it, every door that had been closed, every morning she had spent rebuilding after something destroyed, every mile of road she had walked with bleeding feet and nowhere to go, because all of it, every step, had been moving her toward a plume of smoke in the August sky and a man in a yard who would say, without knowing what it meant yet, the word that would change everything: stay. She had stayed. She was still staying. She intended to stay for a very long time. The winter of 1880 settled into the Carson property with the same cold seriousness as the winter before it, and they were ready for it. The cellar was full. The firewood was stacked. The window frames were caulked. James had 2 warm blankets and a set of woolen socks that Lenora had knitted herself in September. The cattle were in good condition. The barn was tight. The house was warm. On Christmas Eve they sat by the stove in the kitchen after James had been put to bed, in the same chairs they had occupied through that first winter when nothing had been said and everything had been building. The lantern was on the table between them in its exact same place. "I keep thinking about a year ago," Isaac said quietly. She looked at him. "The ruling, the evening in the yard, when Voss came," he paused. "When I said what I said, when you proposed to me in front of a man you were actively attempting to intimidate," she said. "Yes." He looked at her with that combination of slight chagrin and solid affection she had come to love particularly. "I am still sorry about the manner of it." "I am not," she said honestly. "It was very you. You saw a vulnerability he was going to use and you closed it, and you chose the truth as the method. I would not have had you do it any other way." He was quiet for a moment. The stove settled. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "I had the ring before Voss came," he said. "I had written to my sister in Cleveland in November and asked her to send my mother's ring. It had arrived the week before Voss's rider brought the message. He looked at the stove. I had been trying to work out how to ask you properly. In all the confusion of Voss arriving, I had not yet found the moment. She looked at the blue stone on her hand. So when you said it in the yard, she said slowly, you were not improvising. I was improvising the timing, he said. I was not improvising the intention. She looked at him. Isaac, she said, yes. I love you a great deal. He looked at her across the lantern light. 2 years of suppers and silences and legal battles and winter mornings, and a son asleep down the hall, and a property that had been earned and defended, and was theirs in every way that mattered. And I love you, he said. In a way I had not understood was possible before August of 1878. When a woman with bleeding feet walked across your field, she said. When the most remarkable person I had ever met walked across my field, he corrected gently, and asked for water and stayed for supper. She stood up and crossed the kitchen and sat beside him instead of across from him, and he put his arm around her and she rested against his shoulder, and the stove burned steadily, and James slept soundly down the hall, and the winter pressed against the windows in the way that winters do, testing the seams, finding them whole. In the spring, she would plant the garden again, and James would watch from his basket and then from his feet. In the summer, Caleb and Harriet and Clara would come to visit, and the house would be full of noise and laughter, and the particular chaos of people who love each other in close proximity. In the fall, she would discover that James was going to have a sibling, which he would receive with the measured consideration of someone deciding their opinion about a development. And through all of it, every season, every morning and evening of the long and good life they built together on that flat Kansas land with the wide sky above it, and the creek running bright in the summer, and the snow coming down clean and white in December, Isaac Carson would say it. Stay. In the morning over coffee. In the evening by the stove. In the small and daily and unremarkable moments that are the actual substance of a life. He would say it and she would hear it in all its meanings, the first time and the December time and every time after, the hospitality and the hope and the question and the answer and the declaration and the simple, daily, permanent truth of it. Stay. And she always did.